So we have three wonderful authors here today who've written three very different books. I think this might be the most varied panel I've ever hosted in my career, and I'm very excited about it. I'm going to introduce them all. So next to me we have Josie McSkimming, who is a social worker, psychotherapist, university lecturer and author. She's the youngest of three sisters, her eldest being the award-winning poet and trailblazing queer writer Dorothy Porter. She wrote Gutsy Girls, which is the subject of today, and our trailblazing panel. Welcome, Josie.
Thank you.
Next along we have Vicki Hastrich, who is a Sydney writer. Her two novels, Swimming with the Jellyfish and The Great Arch, were followed by the memoir Night Fishing. And her latest book, The Last Days of Zane Grey, is a biography about Zane Grey, and it is not actually out yet. It's out next month. So after this session today, I feel like you're all going to open your phones and pre-order Vicki's book so that it lands at your door in July, because it is a fantastic read. But I am sorry that it's not available today. But Vicki's other books are out in the bookshop as well, and I'm sure she'd be happy to sign them. So welcome, Vicki. And finally, we have Laura Elvery, who's the author of the novel Nightingale and two award-winning short story collections, Trick of the Light and Ordinary Matter. She joins us here from Brisbane. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
Nightingale is bright yellow, and Gutsy Girls, I'm going to drop something if I lift that up, but thank you, Josie. That's Gutsy Girls there, so that you recognise them in the bookshop when the time comes. Okay. We have such rich and varied material to get through today, spanning historical fiction with Nightingale, creative non-fiction and personal biography. And this conversation really, I think, has the potential to explore what it means to be a trailblazer. So Laura, I'd love to start with you and your historical novel. Could you give us a little bit of background on who Florence Nightingale actually was and what drew you to writing about her as a trailblazer?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So some of you will know about Florence Nightingale, even just the image that appears on the cover of the book, The Lady with the Lamp. So she was born in 1820 in Florence to a wealthy English family. She was the younger sister to Parthenope, and they she lived a very privileged life. They had two homes in England. Her father, despite having wanted a son, had these two daughters and gave her a really, really terrific education based on his Cambridge education. So she was a very intelligent young woman, learnt Greek, Latin, Hebrew, music, maths, composition, all of these sorts of things. And was also a very religious girl, had a visitation from God, the first of two, when she was 16, imploring Florence to do something of service. And she didn't know yet what that service would be. Years later, it became apparent to Florence that it was to nurse people. And at this point in her life, the expectation for Florence was that she would live between these two homes, go to the London society balls, meet a husband, get married, have children, and keep a home. So when she said to her family, actually what I would like to do is be a nurse, they were absolutely horrified, like fainting, falling about, crying for months. And it took her many, many years and some help of family friends to convince them that this was a profession that she could do, because at this stage, nursing as a profession did not exist. Existed in the home, existed in religious orders. But when Florence Nightingale set out to pioneer nursing, the common conception at the time was that nurses were corrupt, drunk, incompetent. It was not a respectable career for middle-class, working-class girls at all. And so her life was very interesting to me as I was finishing writing Ordinary Matter, which is about women scientists who won the Nobel Prize. A little spark came to me. I heard a story about Simpson and his donkey, and my mind was still in this world of women, caring, bodies, surgery, medicine, and my mind just made a little novelist flick over to the female equivalent, and I thought of Florence Nightingale, and that's when I started, and that was about 4 or 5 years ago.
I'm really looking forward to asking you about the research in a little bit. But Vicki, so Zane Grey arrives in Sydney in the 1930s with 166 pieces of luggage, intent on filming 2 movies, writing a great Australian novel, and hunting great white sharks. I really have to say that I never thought I would be so invested in a book that's largely about fishing. But I really, really was. So who was Zane Grey? Tell us about Zane Grey, please.
Hello, everybody. Well, Zane Grey was an American writer, and he came to Australia twice in the 1930s. He was the world's first millionaire author. He basically invented the genre of the American Western and burnt those landscapes and character types into the American psyche. And of course that was exported all around the world. And his bestsellers, with which he wrote many, he was very prolific, they were all turned into movies because Hollywood came into being at just the same time, so through the 20s and 30s, and they remade his movies. And of course they were also exported around the world. So when he came to Australia, Australians just went nuts for him. We were huge fans, huge consumers of his work, and every tiny little town had many Zane Grey westerns playing. And they knew his name better than that of their own Prime Minister, really. And he came to Australia to go big game fishing because this was a brand new glamour sport. So he came with an entourage, and when he arrived, his ocean liner docked at Circular Quay. There was a bevy of reporters there ready to zoom out the information across Australia of every single little thing he did or said, which made my life easy and difficult, but I was able to track his basic every movement because of that. Yeah.
I wrote this down because I was sickened by it. He used to write something, 10,000 words a day.
He could when he was really on a blast.
Yeah.
He didn't do that much revision though, so his wife did a lot of that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that really made me sick. And he'd written more than 9 million words in his life, 90 titles. Any writers in the room, and I'm sure us on stage, will be horrified by that. Prolific. What an interesting character. I'm really excited to get more into Zane Grey in a little bit, but Josie, to you. Your book is a heartfelt, vulnerable tribute to your late sister Dorothy Porter. I'm quite sure that most of us know who she is, being Australians, but could you give us a little bio anyway for those who might not be familiar?
Sure. You know, I'm very glad to see you all here this afternoon in the sort of the graveyard shift, so it's really lovely. And I'm glad too that a lot of people here are of a certain age, which means that a lot of people here will remember Dorothy Porter, my late sister, who died in 2008, aged 54. And Dorothy was born in 1954, a honeymoon baby to Chester and Jean Porter. And Dorothy, from the earliest time, was precociously creative and intelligent and interesting and different, and created adventures for my other sister Mary and I. I was the youngest of 3, and we really did follow in her footsteps and were guided by, her imagination, her games. And she was also a protector for us in our rather difficult household. Our father was very volatile and violent at times, and Dorothy took the role on, as eldest sisters often do, and she did it very well, of protecting and caring for us at some great cost to herself. But Dorothy, you may well know her as the writer of The Monkey's Mask, which was made into a movie. It was the first, and I think the only, erotic detective story, erotic lesbian detective story written in verse in the world and ever. And Dorothy used to write poetry for those who don't read poetry. So she really wanted her books to be mainstream and to be read. And so many people have read her books, particularly The Monkey's Mask, and said, I've never read poetry in my life and I love this book. So she really was quite exceptional, and I've called her a bit of a unicorn in the literary landscape, the Australian literary landscape.
Thank you. That was a beautiful little tribute. And how did you come to write this book about her? And yourself, I suppose, because your story is in there too.
Yes, my story is in there too. And of course, I started writing her story, and then, you know, you start writing your own story. And I believe that, you know, I'm the only sisterly biography written that anybody can think of. So if anybody knows of another biography written by a sister, I'd be happy to hear about it. It seems to be a genre that's rather neglected. And sibling relationships are so extraordinarily important. And I don't know why it hasn't been more of a genre. But anyway, I know this sounds like a weird answer to your question, and people will think it's weird, but I did write this book because I had an encounter with a kookaburra. And I really did. And I guess my parents were aging, and I was really quite depressed and anxious about the journey ahead. As anybody here will know what it's like when you're caring for parents in the last stages of their lives. And I was thinking about, you know, I wanted to talk to Dodd, as I call her. Anyway, I saw a kookaburra when I was on my little walk trying to get my head together, and that kookaburra said to me, write my story. And I'd never thought of it before. I came home, I rang up my sister, I rang up Dorothy's partner, and I said, what do you think? And they went, oh, a sister's bio. And I said, well, the kookaburra told me. And our family are great bird lovers and bird watchers and twitchers. And Dorothy always said that we come back as birds, like the ancient Egyptians and the Greeks thought. And I think she spoke to me, and so I wrote it. But of course, in writing her story, I ended up writing my own story, which was fairly inevitable.
And wasn't your original intention, was it?
Never. I was just going to write a straight bio. I mean, I'm a social worker, I'm a psychotherapist. I've written academic book. You know, I'm an academic, but I'd never written anything like this before, so I thought, I'll just write a bio. Well, I didn't.
We'll get into that. Vicki, in what ways is Zane Grey a trailblazer, do you believe? In what ways did he defy convention for the time?
Well, in his writing, he travelled extensively throughout the American landscape and to sort of wilderness places. So he's very much a trailblazer in that respect, just camping out, mind you, still with an entourage, but and guides, but he went to very wild places, so he really did introduce that landscape to people. And teach people to value wilderness. That sort of whole movement in America and that national parks movement was only just beginning to. So instead of just using landscape to value it for its own sake, for beauty. And he was also quite an early conservationist in terms of being worrying about clearfell logging and responsible fisheries as well. But in coming to Australia, his trailblazing was to do with this new sport of big game fishing, and he glamped down at Bermagui and then Bateman's Bay first of all, and a lot of the wealthy Sydney and Melbourne set rushed down there to see if they could beat him at his own game fishing, and so he was after marlin, and we didn't really know much about the contents of our seas. So he was at the forefront of kind of showing people what was there, like bringing creatures up from the deep to show people these marvels, and the denizens too, because in those days, a good shark was a dead shark, but a really big shark that was dead was great. And he sort of had a growing obsession with sharks because although he arrived here looking like he was on top of the world, in fact, underneath his finances and life was shaky, and he was juggling a lot while he was here, including a secret Australian lover. But he also was, and so just to finish up that science and fishing nexus, he was always in touch with marine scientists, and the two groups fed each other information. The scientists were reliant on people like Grey to bring up these fish for them to study. And Grey also realised that swimming past our coastline were tuna, and that was an industry that was worth a lot of money that Australia could benefit from. And in fact, from his catch that day, the tuna industry down the south coast of Australia was started. But he was also, people coalesced around him, other trailblazers. So he had correspondence with Miles Franklin, and so that was a really great surprise for me to come across that. It's not what you would expect at all. And of course, Miles was a trailblazer herself, undeniably. And also Charles Kingsford Smith, Grey knew him, and it was instrumental in helping him out with their famous flight from the Trans-Pacific flight he made from America to Australia. So there's all sorts of trailblazing avenues attached around him.
Yeah, and I also think that one of the most interesting and unique things about Zane Grey, or ZG, as the people called him, was his approach to love and relationships. You mentioned that he had a secret Australian lover who was one of many lovers, but what I found unconventional was that he loved his wife so much all throughout, and that she knew about these lovers, and I'd not encouraged them, but he certainly financed some of their trips to Australia to join him. That's pretty unconventional for the time, right?
Totally. And he had these, he warned his wife Dolly when they were engaged that he could never be monogamous. He was a man, he was a very sexual man, obviously, and he was also in love with love, so he loved to fall in love. But his relationships were really interesting because they were always long-term, and so they were real genuine commitments, and the women were young, but they were always really intelligent, independent women, much like Dolly was, and had this unconventional streak as well. So very interesting marriage and relationships, all of them.
Definitely. Laura, Florence Nightingale was such a fascinating character, and she also defied convention for her time. Particularly, you touched on this a little earlier about the career choice that she made, how she felt about marriage, which was obviously very expected of women in her day. Could you talk to that a little bit, and in what ways she did defy convention?
Yeah, so Florence was, people proposed to Florence Nightingale in her life, and she said no, particularly to a man named Monckton Miles, for about 10 or 12 years. Kept on saying no. And I said before how religious she was. She didn't think marriage was bad. She thought women ought to get married if they really wanted to. But what she knew in herself was that she wouldn't be able to have a life of the mind. She never thought she would be able to find a husband who could sort of match her for adventure and to kind of leave her alone a little bit. So she never married, never had children. But something else that was really interesting when I was researching Nightingale, I read a book called 9 Hypochondriac Lives by Brian Dillon, which is an extraordinary book. And Florence went to Crimean War. She got what was called then Crimean fever, which we know now is probably called brucellosis. So came back very unwell and kind of when she came back from the Crimean War in 1856, thought she was dying often. She lived till she was 90, so my book starts the night before she dies in 1910, because straight away that was interesting to me, when the life expectancy was 43 for women. She lived till she was 1910, thought she was unwell. And one of the other things that Brian Dillon talks about in this book about hypochondria is, yes, she was unwell physically, but Florence knew that for a spinster, for a wealthy woman, the only way that she would be able to keep her war office, that she called it, this little war office, and write her correspondence and her evidence for royal commissions, reports, books, reams of work, was if she kind of tucked herself away a little bit, because he posits a woman of her means, if she didn't marry, would be summoned at every point that anybody else in the family needed somebody to care for them. So she would be distracted, she would start a book, someone would interrupt her. She would be doing her embroidery, somebody would interrupt her. Auntie so-and-so gets unwell in Derbyshire, Florence can go. So his assertion, which is, you know, based on some evidence I found totally fascinating, this idea that in literature and in the Victorian era, some of these women, physically unwell, perhaps found a lot of independence in being unwell in a different way and being able to close those doors and be left alone with their thoughts. And so some of that is in Nightingale as well. But she also called the soldiers from the Crimean War, she called them her sons, she called them her children. So the starting point for the book also is that Florence has been haunted by some of these boys of hers, some of these men from the Crimean War.
And is that where the idea came to you? Like, did you think to yourself, what would have happened to Florence Nightingale? Was she haunted by the ghosts of the past, and then you decided to write what might happen?
As soon as I knew she was 90, that was fascinating to me, because I have that image that you have probably seen where she's about 35, she's got the bonnet, and I think in my mind, when I was researching these other women for Ordinary Matter, the Nobel Prize winners, I thought she died young, and then she lived till she was 90, and so 1820 to 1910, like the changes, electricity had come to London by the time she died, the things that Florence would have seen totally fascinated me. 20,000 men in the British Army died. That number is, you know, in flux a little bit. Many of them due to neglect, bureaucratic neglect, starvation, dysentery, some war wounds, but a lot of them is. And I just had in my mind an image that surely she would have been haunted. Wasn't all her fault. There's a lot of scholarship about this. Obviously not her fault. She cut the death rate almost immediately that she arrived in Scutari barracks in Turkey. But how could you not feel guilty, and how could you not be haunted by these boys that you called your boys, and what more could you have done in the Scutari barracks? So that was sort of the starting point. The night before she dies, a knock on the door, and in a novelist way, it's really fun to be like, who is this person at the door?
Thank you. Josie, there's absolutely no doubt that your sister was a trailblazer in her work, even just what you mentioned before with The Monkey's Mask, a lesbian detective verse novel. I mean, what even is that? And you were quite jealous of her when you were younger, and you write about that. And your life took quite a different turn to hers, though. Could you talk a little bit about the part of the book where you bring in your personal narrative and how it moved away from Dorothy's life?
It's not quite true that I was jealous of her. I always was very proud of her because she was so exceptional, and she was 6 years older than me, so we weren't competing like siblings that are much closer in age. But I guess my own hypothesis about this is that we three sisters found ways of responding to what we went through in our family household in the best ways we could. Now, Dorothy didn't just write because she came from this rather difficult, violent household. That would be far too simplistic and linear for me to say that, because Dorothy would have written brilliantly, I would say, no matter what household she came from. But she certainly found refuge and strength by writing from a very early age. And she wrote her first book when she was about 6, and she wrote many, many books, published and unpublished. Now me, I felt rather invisible in my family and scared and worried about my own place in that family and my own relevance and importance to the family, as I guess a lot of kids do. And Dorothy showed me the way to find some kind of meaning in my life, which was very ironic. She used to go off to church camps run by the Church of England. And she loved these church camps because they were all girls and there was lots of fun and falling out of canoes and all girls together. And she just fell in love with all the women leaders who really weren't much older than her. So I always thought I wanted to go on these church camps too, because I wasn't having any fun at all at home. And I was pretty miserable when I was about 9. And I went on this church camp, and then I just broke all the rules because I made Jesus the Lord of my life. And Dorothy nearly died, and my parents were shocked, and I told them all they were all going to hell. And so it went on, and I found this refuge in the church and became very devout and very conscientious. And some people are thinking here, well, she probably didn't last long in that. Well, I hate to tell you, I stayed in that church for 35 years, and I didn't leave till I was 45. However, I did leave very, very slowly, many years before I finally did leave. And the book is about being part of a high-demand religion and what that means and how it affected my relationship with Dorothy and with Mary. And so that's the kind of the parallel strand of this book.
And what was it that made you slowly, let's say, break up with the church in your 40s? Was there a particular moment, or was it more an overarching theme that you couldn't quite get your head around by that point? Can you talk to that a little?
Yes, it's actually many, many, many incidents which I've called sites of injury. I have kind of researched this academically about people who leave churches and have to reconstruct their identity. And I think probably for about the 20 years before I left, there were many small catalytic moments where I thought, I don't think that. And these thoughts, this sense of self, this alternative identity is kind of buried because you're very invested in the church. Emotionally, socially, economically, the church becomes your life. It's just a sort of a one-stop shop. And to start the process of leaving is very, very difficult. But underneath, there was a double life. So these many sites of injuries, and they were often ethical incongruences, moments of misogyny and homophobia. And in the end, you start to pull back bit by bit. You cease your ceaseless involvement till eventually you stop going altogether. So it tends to be gradual. And I do a lot of work now with people who experience what we sometimes call religious trauma.
I've read a lot about evangelical Christianity and people who leave for my own research for my first book as well. So I find it very fascinating. And what happens so often is that one or more of family members are estranged when they have such different beliefs. And what I loved about Gutsy Girls was that you and Dorothy were never estranged. You still
never.
Loved each other and were in each other's lives, despite the fact that you thought your family were going to hell and told them so, and that she was a gay poet. You still had a relationship, which is rare.
Look, I think about this a lot, and I've sort of tracked it to when I was about 14, and we were on the Indian Pacific with my parents, and we formed this very, very unlikely bond, and I realised I could tell her things about my place in the family, how I felt, and she was very confidential and very caring and very accepting. And there's nothing like shared grievances or a shared sense of injury to create closeness. And we shared a lot of grievances about Chester, our father, and we shared grievances about our other sister. You know, there was a lot of stuff that we had in common. But yes, it was in the background, though, my condemning Christian ways, which for a period of time did drive a wedge between us. So there were ebbs and flows, but we really did love each other a lot.
Vicki, you mentioned before Zane Grey's intersection with the iconic Miles Franklin. Could you tell us that story? Because that was one of the most amazing parts of the book to me and really brings it home to the Australian literary scene as well.
Well, Miles Franklin basically wrote to Zane Grey out of the blue, and it was a gutsy cold call she made on him. And if you read this letter, which is in the book, she just blasts off the page, this huge personality, and she just starts straight off bossing him around. And she says, I have been out in the bush and I've had the misfortune to have no books to read. And so I prevailed upon one of the young hands around the place to go and bring me back books. And do you know what he brought me? All Zane Grey novels. And she's sort of like, what the? And what am I meant to do with that? And she had just published a book in Australia, which under a pseudonym though, that Zane Grey had praised in the papers and said, this is the quintessential Australian novel and it's the best thing I've read while I've been here. And I think people just, sent books to him all the time. So he did have quite a good sample. And this is what his praise prompted her to write to him. And she was always so fierce about Australian writing and Australianness. So she was appealing to him for help, to get a wider audience, and she desperately wanted to be published in the US to be able to make a proper living, and that this hand-to-mouth scrabbling around, which we still do, was, causing further difficulty, limiting her art. And so he very generously did reply. He found her approach rather grating and this sort of damned woman. But he wrote kindly back to her, and he did do his best to pass on her work to publishers. And so they had ongoing correspondence sort of following that. But I love that actually in the end Miles didn't need his help. She was a self-starter and scrimped and saved to make that money, which is now the Miles Franklin Award. So
such a great part of this story, and that letter that she wrote him is hilarious. There's a real passive-aggressive undertone, I feel. Like, what am I meant to do with all these Zane Grey bloody novels? It's very funny. I'd love to hear about the process of finding that primary material when you were doing the research for the book. There is so much detail. You really feel like you were there. It leaps off the page as it is, and there's so much detail. Where did you get that from, and what was that research process like?
Well, it was huge because he lived a huge life and every single aspect of it. Like if you just tried to keep track of his books, that is a lifetime's sort of work in itself, or his relationships. Each area was huge. But what I did actually was to build this ginormous Excel spreadsheet, unsexy as that sounds. And so it's basically a timeline, or a couple, really, a one for his whole life, and then one for each of his trips to Australia, so I could go into more detail. So I had over 1,000 entries in the end, but that way I could keep track of the tiniest detail, and and build all the time and keep track of the sources, because always I could check or cross-check. And there was so much available in the newspaper. So Trove, this national gift we have, which is available through the National Library when you can check newspapers and search them really well. And thank goodness the other great gift was Zane Grey's name, because it was easily searchable. And I looked up almost every single newspaper entry that had his name, and that's how I found things like his relationship with, I clearly remember this, with Charles Kingsford Smith, because when I came to write each chapter I had a sort of outline of what I'd do, and I had my master timeline, but then I'd go in and really re-research that time period, shorter time period. And one of the searches that came up for that chapter threw up this entry for Charles Kingsford Smith, and I thought, am I really going to read that? That's just going to be a Zane Grey movie or some mention like that. I did look it up and I read it, and it turned out that this was an article about a lucky rabbit's foot Zane Grey had given Charles Kingsford Smith, which was being re-gifted back to Australia after Kingsford Smith's death, to be put in a sort of national museum, really.
What a treasure trove that there is online. Laura, your book is historical novel, ghost story, love story, all the things. It's not just Florence Nightingale. You've got two other characters, Silas and Jean. Where did they come from? Are they real people?
No, but somebody did go on Wikipedia and try to find the nurse that I've created, so I thought that was really terrific. So Jean is her name. When Florence went to the Crimea in November 1854, she very quickly recruited 38 young women to go with her to be part of this foray to the Scutari barracks outside Constantinople. Quickly recruited, and I just was very interested in these 38 women. So Jean is my creation, but based on research about these women. I just wondered, it's just a gift for a novelist to think, why would they have gone? They left from Folkestone in England via France over to Turkey. Some were women of religious orders, but Florence wanted them all to be secular, so they were working class women, middle class women as well. And I just wondered what would compel a young woman to have taken this journey, very quickly recruited. And that led me to Jean, and I thought there might be women there who are absolutely adventurous, brave, daring, all of those things, curious, or escaping something, or a combination of those. And that's my Jean Frawley. And Silas Bradley is the man who knocks on the door at the start of the book, and he is based on British Army soldiers who I researched as well. But as you said, I stuck to the historical record for so much of the book. Like you mentioned, all of the correspondence that Zane had. One of the Florence Nightingale biographies I read, there's loads of them, is by a man named Mark Bostridge, and it's about 700 pages, and it's totally riveting. I'm not kidding. It's so good. And at the start he said, she was the second most famous woman in the world, second to Queen Victoria. And he said a biographer loves coming across correspondence and things that their subject has written, but one wishes Florence had written just a little bit less, because he had to go through all of these primary materials, volumes of things that she wrote. So I enjoyed going through those biographies and researching other young nurses who were under her charge. And what would that have been like to be a nurse under Florence? So we see Florence at the Crimean War from the perspective of Jean, this young woman who, in opposition to Florence, is not from a wealthy family, has never been anywhere, has lived a very different life. And I thought that contrast, that was interesting to me.
And how did you balance the myth and the creativity and the fictional parts of it with what you knew, and it was, you know, we are allowed to take creative license as writers. How much did you feel you could take?
I mean, that's the real question. That's the big question we were talking about as well. I was very careful to, I mean, I love reading historical fiction, and I was very careful to stick to the historical record for the things that I thought were important for the narrative. So the dates and the names of the ships and the journey they took, what they wore, what they ate, how much they were paid, the rules Florence had set out for her nurses when they met these soldiers that they were to nurse, the interactions between Florence, who basically became a hospital administrator very early on, you know, arguing back and forth with the men in England and going over to Constantinople herself to buy things from the bazaar because the British Army were, in her eyes, totally incompetent. And then it's a ghost story and it's a romance. And it's very liberating as a novelist to be able to do those things. And I just had to early on decide what was part of my story and what's part of Florence's story, which is so enormous, 90 years. But what I wanted to put in the novel, I diverged at very specific points.
Speaking of primary source material, Josie, you had a lot to go through. Not just Dorothy's published and unpublished works, but her diaries and letters. How did you come to be the keeper of those?
She kept a diary from when she was about 14 till just before she died, sometimes twice daily. And they're all kept in these Ancol exercise books in her scrawling handwriting. And the more recent ones were in the possession of her partner, which she gave to me to read. But the majority of them are in the library in Canberra, ADFA, the Australian Defence Force Academy Library. And you'll be thinking, what? But in the 90s, ADFA was giving Australian writers quite a lot of money to give their papers to them. And as we've discussed many times, Australian writers don't have any money. And so Dorothy jumped at it. And so there are boxes and boxes of diaries and letters, and the novel that she wrote when she was 14 that I wasn't allowed to read, called A Schoolgirl's Dream. Because, you know, I was 8 and so I wasn't allowed to read it. And all of this was there, this fabulous stuff. And let me say, there's another whole cache of letters at the National Library, but that's more recent, and that's letters between her and her partner, a lot of those, and photocopies of emails. And so it's like what you were saying, Laura, you have to work out what you're going to focus on. And I thought, I can't read all those letters in the National Library as well. My husband, James, who's here, we did many trips down to ADFA. We just spend all day there in the John Howard Reading Room. It is called the John Howard Reading Room, and surrounded by photos of John and Jeanette and him with Cherie and Tony Blair. And it's also got his Chesterfield from Old Parliament House there, this big green Chesterfield. And so I would lie on this Chesterfield reading these diaries, and I had to photocopy them because I couldn't take anything home. And so James would sit at this photocopying machine, we'd spend so much money, just page after page after page, while I was kind of lying on the Chesterfield thinking, will I copy that? And there were letters from all of her boyfriends. They were all my letters. It was absolutely intriguing that I'd written to her when I was little, tiny, all these letters. And I was ringing up my sister Mary going, you've got no idea what Dorothy kept. Everything. And so they now have a rope around that Chesterfield. Because I think I wasn't supposed to be lying on it.
Sounds like you got in at the right time. We could go another hour with these three trailblazers, and I mean the authors as well as the characters. But I will open to questions from you soon. So if you do have any, start to think of them now. We've got roving microphones. And I want to ask one more for myself. I'm trying to decide which of my remaining questions to ask, but I think this is the one I'd like to ask. What do you think is the lasting legacy of the Trailblazer you have written about? Let's start with you, Laura.
A bit probably quite straightforward for me. International Nurses Day is celebrated every year on the 12th of May, which is Florence's birthday. The professionalisation, she set up the first nursing school in the world, soon set up copy clinics in Australia and Africa, all around the world. They were called Nightingales, the first batch of nurses who came out of St Thomas's Hospital in Lambeth. There's a small scene in the book there. Sent all over the world, and they were considered these first-class nurses called Nightingales. And just very quickly, I mean, Florence's rules for those nurses were what now seem really basic to us. Open the window, let the sunlight in, warm the room, sanitation, ventilation, wash your hands, speak with dignity to a patient, speak calmly to them, wash things without complaint. That was a very unusual approach. Treat everyone regardless of their religion, no proselytising. So this idea of setting it up as a really respectable career for all genders became the legacy that I see. Yeah.
Thank you. Vicki?
I think for me it's the fact that Zane Grey's life is actually a really good marker of how our natural world has changed. And to think that in really the lifetime of by the time his children were aging, already our seas were irrevocably changed and decimated. And to just see it in the terms of his single lifetime, when he was here in Australia in the 1930s, my parents were, children, and they were alive at this time when people really didn't know what was in our ocean. It was that untouched, relatively speaking. And we had no idea what our fisheries were. Our fisheries science had been dreadfully neglected, so we really didn't know what was there. And these were the marvels he was bringing up to show people. And to just think that in that short space of time, it's changed so much.
If you want to know whether Zane Grey ever did find the great white shark of his dreams, you'll need to pre-order Vicki's book. We won't spoil it for you. Josie, what about you?
Well, my late sister has left an enormous body of work, and we were talking about in the green room about how quickly social memory fades. The waters close over some of our greats in this country, and her books were everywhere. And The Monkey's Mask is still available very easily. It's never gone out of print. But a lot of her books, it's been a bit of an effort to sort of keep them in print. And there is such an enormous body of work. And I guess in a way, writing this book really brought her back to me, and I hope to a new audience, perhaps younger people who hadn't heard of her, who think they kind of invented queer literature, or that they were the ones, who were breaking taboos. And when they read Akhenaten or The Monkey's Mask or any one of her books, or Crete, they realise, oh my God, yeah, Dorothy really did break a lot of rules. She was very iconoclastic, and she wanted to be noticed, and she wanted to be remembered. And I guess that's what I'm hoping from this book.
Yeah, you've definitely contributed to that legacy. I'd like to open for questions now. Does anybody have any in the audience today, this afternoon? Just up the front, thank you.
Thank you, Benny. I recently read a biography of Henry Parkes, and Henry Parkes contacted Florence Nightingale to say, so that I thought you might be able to tell us more. No, but obviously he'd heard about the Nightingales and that's a new term for me that wasn't used in the book, but he sent, asking Florence Nightingale to send a body of nurses to come here to educate women to become nurses here in Australia, and that started what has been happening in the hospital since.
Yeah, there's a band of nurses came out to Australia and followed her lead and the public health measures that she implemented. A story I've found, this is the thing with Florence Nightingale, people keep sending me cool stories. I keep finding cool stories like a week before it went to print. I have to stop researching her, but I think I'll also research her forever. But an Australian connection that I found out more recently, so I haven't delved into it, is that Queen Victoria's son, there was an attempted assassination on his life in Australia, and one of the nurses who helped him was a Nightingale. So Queen Victoria was already a big fan of Florence Nightingale, gave her a brooch, thought she was a really fascinating woman when they met, and that just sort of cemented this idea in Queen Victoria's mind that Florence was this incredible woman. Yeah, I'll just keep writing about her.
Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
My question is for Vicki. I would love to know what Zane Grey would think of the modern cowboy that we seem to be so obsessed with, i.e. Yellowstone, etc. What would he think of what his legacy has done to cowboys now?
Yeah, look, that is a tough question. I think he'd be probably wholly approving that whole myth genre continues to evolve as well. And I know there's plenty of people in America who are dedicated to keeping that alive as well. So, yeah, I think he'd be very glad that on it goes.
We have time for one more question, but if we don't have any from you, I have one of my own. So don't panic. But does anybody have a question? Yes, just in the front here. Thank you.
You said about Dorothy being kind of iconoclastic, and I remember seeing her give the inaugural Judith Wright lecture.
I've wrote about that in the book.
Yeah, Poets Week. And it was profoundly challenging of the writing community. I was wondering, how was she received by the writing community?
Oh, you know, I was there too. Geez, much younger we were. I was there too, and that was when she was reading Judith's poem about the massacre of the Aboriginal people around Armidale, which is called, and I apologise for the name of the poem, was called Nigger's Leap. And Judith wrote this poem, and she was about one of the first people about in the 1940s, and David Marr was talking about this, who actually spoke about massacres. And so Judith Wright was really amazing, and so that lecture was really wanting to celebrate Judith's legacy. Look, it's very hard for me to say in the writing community. In the poetry community, they often are a bit rivalrous with each other because it was a very small pie everybody had to fight over, and I think they probably still do. And some people didn't like her work. Dorothy always complained that she never got literary grants when other people did, so she was very pissed off about that. But she had lots of faithful supporters. I mean, she had like groupies who loved her, and she loved that too. So I think she had quite a lot of respect in the writing community, but also sometimes people didn't know what to make of her because she really did create a stir. She didn't want to just say nothing. And so in that lecture, she did create a stir. She really did. And she challenged people about our relationship with the Indigenous people of this country. And not many people were doing that. That was in about 2001.
That's so interesting because Zane Grey was also similarly critical of Australians' relationship with the Indigenous people. Could you speak to that briefly? Because we didn't get to touch on it, but it really ties in nicely here.
Yeah, he was very respectful of Indigenous Australians when he came across. Whenever he travelled, he always was interested in the local Indigenous people, and throughout America too, of course. And he supposedly had some Indian blood too. But he immediately recognised that the relationships to the land and the knowledge was very special. And he told Australia when asked, when he was leaving the first time and speaking to reporters, he said, "You are not as respectful of your Aboriginal people as you should be. They are knowledgeable people."
I bet they loved hearing that.
Yeah.
Isn't it interesting how almost 100 years later it's still quite true? I'm going to sneak in one final question, which is, what do you think life would be like for Dorothy, Zane and Florence today? Do you think that they would be cancelled on social media for their trailblazing? Who wants to, Laura? Yeah.
Just quickly, I touched on the complicated history of Florence Nightingale and is slightly contested now, and there are biographies about her. I think it's really interesting to me to read all of those articles about Florence, and a complicated woman, probably quite difficult to live with in some ways, probably quite a short temper in some ways. I don't know what she'd think about my book. Maybe she'd think that was, a bit strange to have written about her, but, not without ego, but also very giving and very generous. And I think it's really important to embrace all of those complex parts of her personality. I heard Jane Caro talk a little while ago on the radio about being a woman of her time, and she was a woman of her time, but I'm a woman of my time as well. So, yeah.
What do you think, Vicki?
Well, I think Zane would travel very well in today's circumstances, because he really understood publicity in a very early but really modern way, and he knew how to make it work for him, even though he was an incredibly shy man and a loner who surrounded himself with an entourage as a sort of buffer zone between him and the wider world. But yeah, he knew how to chase a headline.
Well, I wonder if Dodd would get cancelled. She used to say very negative things about the Australian cricket team, and she said she wouldn't support them even if they were playing the Third Reich 11. And I thought, oh my God. She said that in a lecture, and I think she would really find the whole Instagram, social media thing really burdensome. And she, like all of us, there's probably a whole bunch of people here that have grown up in a pretty unstable family. You are left with legacies of insecurity and fear, which she was very fearful, which she was kind of her secret life, if you like. And I think people being mean about her on social media would have killed her. She would have hated it, because she liked people to like her, and people are so mean on social media. So I don't think she would have liked it, and I don't think she would have handled it well, and I think she may well have got cancelled.
Thank you so much. It was such a privilege to speak to
Thanks,
the three
Amy.
of you and learn more about these wonderful characters. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. Their books are for sale in the bookshop, and they will be signing at the back as well. But yes, thank you. That was wonderful.
And thank you, Amy.
And thank you, Amy.
Thank you.